So for tonight, fittingly on my birthday of all things, I get to talk about something pretty heavy. Yay. When I was when I was praying about, I wasn't even praying about what to talk about this week. Frankly, I'd considered like just calling it off for the week to just avoid any kind of like any further issues in terms of being late and stuff like that. Especially since it was going to be my birthday, and I figured I might end up doing something other than sleeping. But instead, I ended up having a moment where God just straight told me what He wanted me to talk about. And specifically, it was about this thing that happens. And in a way, tonight's message piggybacks off of the last several messages that we've talked, or the last several things that we've talked about. Because there's been this reoccurring theme underlying a lot of what I've been given to share. And it has been the subject matter of, talking about last week's message about hope, for example. How when you find yourself in a place of losing hope, you have the potential of becoming somebody very different from who you really are. When you're put in a place where you find no reason to continue and everything just becomes about survival or becomes about that momentary getting ahead, short-term success and different things like that, then you can become a very, very different person from the person in your heart. See, the thing of it is that sometimes we talk about people's hearts being corrupted and things like that on occasion. But the truth is that, as I understand it, who you are deep down inside in the core of your being is ultimately a good person. When you come out a little baby, you're not full of evil. Okay? That's not the way it works. The way that God designed us is not to be evil. It's always the big issue with original sin is where does it really come from? Is it environmental or is it genetic? And the truth is that there's a lot of theological debate that really doesn't mean anything. It's just a lot of people looking at a verse and giving different perspectives on it while fighting. The truth of the matter is that when we talk about God and His perspective, the only one that we're given is that of Him looking at His creation and saying that He was pleased with it. So, the thing that we run into right here is how we become so far from Him. Well, little kids are easy to manipulate. We talk about spirits, we talk about people, we talk about all the many, many influences that we deal with on a routine basis. A lot of the times kids will glean from their parents in ways that their parents don't even see coming. And what really can suck is if you're the kind of person who isn't completely aware of all the things that you're doing. You think you're better than you are. And then, suddenly your kids start acting like you. And you're getting a mirror that you don't really like. I remember one guy, he was a pastor of a church group. He hated one of his kids. He would never admit it, but it was illustrated in every way that he treated that boy. Couldn't stand him. His boy was acting like he was. His kid would come up and mooch off people and kind of try to manipulate people and play things up and talk them out of things and different things like that. Just ate at his dad every single day. His dad was the exact same way. But dad thought he had to overcome this. Anybody who had ever come close in knowing this kid's dad knew that actually he was like that, but he didn't like to see it. And that's the thing, is a lot of us, we're not really aware of who we are in every situation. And sometimes we can really, really blind ourselves to who we are in a situation. And that's that thing. That's that, there are a lot of reasons for that. We talked about hope. We talked about abandonment. We've talked about personal choice, about free will and the reality of that, about the nature of having your own independent ability to make decisions that God has effectively said, okay, you have free will, make your decisions, and we say, okay, we're doing this now. And then so often we'll look at God and be mad at him because we make choices and screw ourselves over, and we want him to bail us out, when the reality is we've been effectively telling him to get away from us for like a year straight or whatever amount of time. This whole process has been involved in us saying, I'm going to do this my way, and God says okay, and then we get to the end of it and our way didn't work out. Shock. Or it does work out, and it turns out that the end result wasn't actually what we wanted or hoped for. It wasn't as good. See, the thing about it is that we have this nasty tendency to become the villain in our own story. See, I would say that I've always held this idea that the best villains, the best written villains, are the ones that in any story are the ones that get you to see their side and even identify with them. A lot of people were big fans of like the Joker in The Dark Knight. They were big fans of Loki off of out of the Marvel movies. Thanos.
Magneto.
Mm-hmm.
Some people loved Magneto.
Huge action.
Or Magneto.
The thing about it is that each of these characters were bad guys. Their intentions, even if they had a good intention, it was surrounded by deeds that were unquestionably evil. And that's the thing too, is like, that's what a good villain does, is they convince you that what they're doing is for the right purposes. A good story, especially if it has a good hero, they'll pull the mask off that and help you see that actually, no, this person is just doing their own thing. There's all those good intentions are just a facade to cover what's actually a selfish motivation, or one that's completely built off of cruelty or something to that effect. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. See, there's a reason why this message comes off the back of one about hope, off of one about abandonment, because those two aspects can be so destructive to our humanity. When we sit in places of abandonment, when we lose hope, we can become bad people so easily. See, if you have a desire to do good things, and every bit of you wants to do good, but you feel like you have no one to help you, suddenly you start to see no purpose in doing things any particular way. When you pull the morality out of the situation, and it becomes, well, I'm going to do whatever I need to in order to make this good thing happen, that's when you start to kind of slant down into this place of, well, this isn't actually a good place anymore. And the funny thing about it is, like, in the Bible we have a lot of examples of this. In stories around us we have a lot of examples of this. In our own lives we have a lot of good examples of this. And usually they're people that have hurt us. Usually the stories that we remember are the people who were trying to help, even though it didn't feel like it. But when we look back, we can objectively say, well, actually they were trying to help in their own way. But we can't excuse the damage that they did. And that's the thing that's always really difficult to navigate, is we have these people who were well-meaning, but ultimately destructive, for one reason or the other. So to kind of like give some background to this, and it's not a simple matter either. It's not like one example is going to fit everything. No, there's a lot of different examples. I can tell stories from my own life where I've been this person. You know, I can point to stories and film and different things like that. And I have a couple examples that we'll talk about. It's just that there are a lot of ways to get here. So, to kind of start off with, we talk about, you know, to look at the Bible. We'll start in Isaiah chapter 1. And I've read this before to this group for different reasons, but to kind of help flesh this out, you see this example where God speaks to the prophet Isaiah with a rebuke to the people of Israel. Starting in verse 10 of chapter 1. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. Your new moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your evil assemblies. Your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Encourage the oppressed. Defend the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. So, the timing of this is rather early on. It's during the time of King Hezekiah, which was the end of Samaria, which was the northern Israelite kingdom. Isaiah was the prophet at the time. He would go and speak to Hezekiah. You can read the stories of that in the books of the Kings and Chronicles. The point is, though, is that at that point in time, and this was about the time that Assyria was a world power, so we're talking like 900 AD, roughly, if I'm remembering, or 900 BC, sorry, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is about 900 years before Jesus came, right? If I'm remembering correctly. But that's the thing, is that early on in the existence of the Israelite kingdoms, we've got God telling the Israelite people, what are you doing? You're doing your sacrifices, you're doing your festivals, you're doing all these different things, and they're meaningless. See, as far as the Israelite people were concerned, they were doing what they were supposed to do. For all intents and purposes, they were performing the acts to be right with God, that they understood to be right with God.
Weren't they told to do this? Wasn't this like missing a law? God saying, hey, do this shit and your sins are cleansed.
Exactly.
Did he change his mind? Like, why did this all of a sudden change?
So this is the thing with it. They were doing the things that they were supposed to do, but they weren't doing them for the reasons that they were supposed to do them. See, what happened, and this happens all the time, is that they had stopped caring about why they were supposed to do these things, and they were just doing them for purposes of being right with God. They didn't care about actually changing. They didn't care about any of the things. The thing that God tells them to look into, to care about, doing right, seeking justice, encouraging the oppressed, defending the cause of the fatherless and the widows. Basically, he's telling them, hey, care about the people around you. Care about the people who need help. Seek what's right. Stop just doing things. A lot of times, Catholics, like Catholic religion, ends up falling into the same thing, where a lot of people will harp on Catholics as a result of their confessions, and the way that confession actually becomes a lot of people show up, they share what went on, and then they're absolved of their sins, and then they just go out and continue to be the same people. There's no transformation, there's no repentance, not really. They just fulfill an obligation. And this is what the Jews were doing at this point in time, and it was why God was angry at them over this particular thing. They were doing what they were supposed to be doing, but they were doing it for the wrong reasons. It's what happens when we start worshiping the letter of the law as opposed to the intention behind it. If you're going to repent, do it because you want to be different, you want to grow, you want to be more, you don't want to do this anymore, not because you're obligated to in order to be close to God. That was the reason behind this. And see, the funny thing is, when you read through the various laws and so on, you can see where a lot of it comes from, like where there were certain things that the Jews believed that allowed them to create a sort of stigma of division between themselves and other people. A lot of the laws that they were given were not actually moral laws. They were simply things to set them apart, so they would be recognized as being a different people from the ones around them. God gave them specific instructions about what they should eat and what they should wear and how to dress, in order to clarify, okay, this is in order to make you look different from the various tribes and cultures around you. Basically, his intention was to make them a beacon to the peoples around them so that they would know, hey, those are God's people. Those are the people of Yahweh. But the way that the Jews took it was they were special and different and better than everybody. And as a result of that, they looked down on the others around them rather than utilizing this difference as a beacon to say, hey, come to me. Come to know who God is. Come to his kingdom and his presence. They instead made it a source of, oh, we're higher and better than you, go away. And it became a source of exclusion. In that way, they became the exact opposite thing to what God had intended them to be. When he talks to them about becoming his people, he talks to them about being a people who people could come to, so that the world could come to know that they were his people, and that the world could be saved through his people. They could come into the temples there and they could know God. But they did the opposite. They took everything that God made them to be and used it as a point of exclusion to separate themselves out from everybody else. And the thing is, when we go into Jesus appearing, we see in Matthew 23, when Jesus is here, he's saying the same things. After Assyria came through and was pushed back, Babylon came through, cleared everybody out, separated the Jews into various parts of their kingdom, and then they were allowed to come back under a new chance to kind of rebuild their kingdom, to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and they just did the same thing. Because it had become a pattern, it had become a part of who they were. So when Jesus shows up in Matthew 23, he's rebuking the Pharisees. I'm not going to read the whole rebuke of the Pharisees, but in Matthew 23, verse 37, starting there, I'll read that, where he expresses his sorrow over Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you are not willing. Look, your house has left you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's just an expression of what Jerusalem had been, what it was supposed to be, and what it had been and continued to be. And what's more, that's Jesus standing there in the midst of these people and saying, showing them the way that he had created. And lo and behold, even after Christ's coming, even after he showed up and talked to his disciples, we then go through and see the story where Paul talks of having to rebuke Peter for doing the same thing, where he separated himself out to go hang out with the Jews and ignoring the Gentiles, and Paul had to go rebuke him. I believe that's in Galatians where Paul talks about that. This is how this happens, is in Christianity, when we start disregarding the intentions, the heart behind what God does and why, and we start worshiping the rules, or trying to look like a Christian, as opposed to actually being a Christian. And when I say Christian, I mean a follower of Jesus. When all of our focus is on appearing to be like Jesus, as opposed to really being different in your heart and soul, this is the outcome. It's nothing but destruction. And we literally become the same thing that God spent all this time, literally from Isaiah through Jesus, through Paul, down, that's hundreds of years. And that's just what's in the Bible covered. That's not even to go into the extra thousands of years with the Catholic Church and the separation from that came from the Protestant Church because they were sick of the same behavior being committed again and again and again. This whole thing follows Christianity like a cancer. And it's just this thing where we continue to fall into that same practice of focusing on the rules over the purpose behind the rules. And as such, we create an identity where we look like Christians, but we're not. We're not Christians. We don't follow Jesus, we pretend to. And nobody escapes this. And what I mean by that is that no matter what we're talking about, any time that you pursue an identity without really wanting to be different, when all that you can do is create a facsimile because you're grabbing pieces of it and then acting like it, you're gonna fall into this same thing, where everything becomes about trying to manifest this, and anybody that comes against you and hurts that facade is going to be subject to you acting out in some way or another. So you'll have people who come forward and look like the best person in the world. I've seen so many times where, I'm supposed to go, I have my aunt or somebody telling me about this great man or woman of God that they know. And they're just like, you gotta meet them. They're so spirit-led. They're so filled with Jesus. And then I go and meet them and just like, you're wrong about that.
Loser?
This person is not who you say they are. Oh, they're totally that. Okay, I'm wrong. Give it a couple of weeks and then they do something really, really terrible. And it's just like, yeah, shock. The thing of it is that there are a lot of people that really want to look great. And that's not wrong, okay? It's not wrong to want to be more than you are, to want to grow past the limitations or the sins in your life or whatever it is that you don't like. But it is wrong to fake it. See, anytime we put on a disguise, you're going to be the same person underneath. Just because you look different doesn't mean you're different. We apply meaning to things that doesn't exist. It's why it's kind of a joke when people say new year, new me, or something like that. You know, the new year is here. Yeah, you have the opportunity to be a different person, but you're still the same person. And unless something fundamentally changes inside your heart and soul and mind, you're just going to keep being the same person. There needs to be something that drives us forward. You have to actually want it in order for there to be something different. And that's where we get into an enormous problem, is that a lot of us don't really want to be different. And a lot of the time it's because we don't see it. See, it's really easy to talk about, because I've been this guy before. My first run through with being in the church involved me going to this little church in Boring that, oh my gosh, is a long and convoluted story, but the essence of it is this, is that for me, I wanted to be the very, very best example of a Christian that I could be. So I did my best to manifest everything that was there. The problem with that was that, yeah, I could have days where I didn't sin. And the funny thing about that was I took great pride in that, because I was so good and other people were not. And it was really frustrating that nobody could get on my level. And I kind of saw them as being pathetic for it, because I did everything based on my own willpower. I said, okay, I'm not going to commit these acts, I'm not going to do these things, I won't swear, I'll look like a fantastic model of Christianity. Look at all these scrubs who can't do the same thing. It's pathetic. Unworthy. You see the problem there? Like, there's a problem there, okay? See, the problem, just to, like, drive it home, is the pride that existed inside of my heart and soul. And you know the funny thing about that? Is that when you're an obscenely prideful person and you're trying to make the world a better place, is that people see that. They feel that. Nobody misses that when you look down on them, because a lot of people can feel that. And as a result, you stop being able to change the world because people don't care what you have to say. When you tell somebody to get on your level, that's an insult. That's not an encouragement. That's not tough love. That's an insult. And what their response is to say, okay, that guy's a jerk. I'm not going to listen to that one. Or, something to that effect. And the funny thing is if you're not able to see yourself clearly for who you are, your own limitations that still exist, it's really easy to become that way because you stop seeing the effects of your own problems, your own sin, as it were. Or to use it another way, or to say another thing to that effect, your own limitations as a human being. And the irony of it is that it's those people. I remember saying so many times, well, I understand that I'm not perfect. I acted like I was. Secretly believed that I was, treated everybody like they were imperfect, but I could understand that I wasn't perfect. It didn't actually register inside anything. It was just something that I said because I knew objectively it was true. And that's the thing, is that it wasn't repentant, it wasn't anything. You know, the thing about, see, I would say that, we can talk about villains, right? In many ways, I was more destructive than I was constructive in that state of being. And it's not like that's something that changes either, because see, once pride gets involved, you start becoming a worse person. And you don't see it. That's the frustrating thing about it, is you're focused on how good you are. You're focused on all the good things that you do, all of your efforts, all your potential. You don't focus on what you're actually doing or how you're actually affecting the people around you. It doesn't even register. So, even recently, you know, I had times when Heather started going through a lot of her like illness and so on, where I wouldn't listen to her about what she was going through because, you know, at first we thought it was stinging nettle and an allergic reaction to that. You know, the first time that she got stung, I actually like mocked her over it because she was being such a baby about the stings. We went out hiking and she got stung up and she was freaking out about it. And I'm just like, just stop. It's fine. You're going to be fine. Relax. But she just kept panicking. And like I teased her about it. And then sure enough, the next day she wakes up having an allergic reaction. Like her throat starts to close up on her. To say that I felt like an ass would be an understatement. But the point is that, you know, it just continued because there was such a place of arrogance there where I understood how this works, and as a result of my understanding, you know, I knew more than she could, and what she was telling me obviously couldn't be true. So she was probably just panicking about it or overreacting or something like that. And then things kept getting worse. So that's the thing about it, is that it took me a while. It finally took a bunch of rebukes from God. I still remember one of them, like Heather and I were sitting down and we were praying together. And we'll do this thing. We've had the group do it before a long time ago. Dusty does it too, but we'll sit down and we'll write a bunch of names on a piece of paper, crumple them up and throw them in a bowl. Pull one out. We won't open it. We'll just pray and ask God to share information with us or share things to pray about or different things, you know, whatever he wants to give us about that person. And we don't know who it is. All that we know is what he's giving us to talk about. So we pick up this one and we're praying about it, and it's this, and both of us get these utterly brutal rebukes of this person about how prideful they are and how they don't know what they're talking about and how they need to start listening and paying attention. And I'm just sitting there like looking at this. I'm like, I know who's in that bowl. I could think of like 3 different people who this could be. Opened up and it was about me. That was not on my list of people who it could be. That's the thing, is that you can't see it when it's you. That's the problem with pride. See, I don't think, when I talk about the villains, right, the best villains are usually ones who think they're doing what's right. Thanos is probably one of the best written Marvel villains that we've seen in the movies. And the reason being is because he thinks he's right. And he even gets people to agree with him. The funny thing is his rhetoric about, like, you know, about limited resources and the need for people to diminish so that they can actually exist and thrive is something that I grew up hearing in environmental circles that I worked around or that I was involved with. They talked about how, I remember it was a fairly familiar statement to hear people say, human beings are nothing but a plague. They need to be wiped out so that the world can be healthy. And I even believed that when I was a teenager. But the thing of it was like, now in the late 2010s, we're seeing this villain who's saying this same thing. There are a lot of people that already believe that. There are a lot of people where he's preaching gospel to them. And that's the thing, it's like, that's the point of why he was such a good villain. is because people identify with that. They agree with that. And the bad part about it is that they don't even see the bad side. They just see an irrelevant standpoint. And that's the thing too, is that for that character, he couldn't see where he was wrong. He couldn't recognize that killing half of the universe was a bad idea, and it was ultimately wrong to do that. Because it's wrong when you remove the choice of individuals to decide how they're going to live or what they're going to do. Also, it's wrong to kill people. That's generally a bad thing. Widely accepted, understood, murder is bad. But it's for a good cause. It doesn't matter. So, and that's the thing, is that the worst people are the ones who genuinely think that they're the most on the right side. When we talk about a lot of those villains, I mean, yeah, like the Joker had no moral qualms. He just didn't care. Loki was in it obviously for himself, but a lot of those villains that we talk about have greater convictions and greater causes that we're after. Magneto being a fine example of that.
He was still right. Just saying.
But wrong in everything that he did.
Well, sometimes even the villains make the good guys sound bad.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
That's the point, though.
And
Yeah.
Thanos didn't really kill people, he unexisted them.
Right. And see, this
They didn't die.
is exactly what I'm talking about.
Ta-da!
See, the thing of it is that we ultimately justify terrible, terrible things in order to warrant a good cause or something like that. You know, it's funny, there's this verse, actually.
The black sheep of the group stand up. Wait.
In Matthew 7, Jesus says an interesting thing about people coming to heaven. He says, starting in verse 21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Before that, he leads into it saying, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them." A long time ago, I was at a church, and the pastor gave an interesting kind of perspective on this passage. And he explained how, another way you could see it, he was just like, if we're going to talk about this in the 2000s, then we would phrase it this way, which is, beware of beware of big smiles and godly attitudes who hide the fact that they're inwardly ferocious wolves. He phrased this thing in a way to recognize the fact that a lot of the times what happens is we see people who put every illustration of being good in front of you in order to convince you that they are, and ultimately they'll destroy you to get what they want, to be who they are. And the thing is that a lot of times we become those people. See, that whole thing where you justify corrupt behavior in order to warrant a good outcome, it doesn't mean anything. If you have to kill 100,000 people in order for a good outcome to happen, it's still bad. You know, when the Nazis came through, were doing experiments on the Jews, we learned a lot about medicine. They jumped our understanding of medicine ahead, tens of years, at least. It doesn't make anything that they did right. We could have had that if we would have, from people who would have been willing to undergo experiments or something like that. We didn't have to torture a bunch of people. But that's what happened. And yeah, there was a good outcome, but it was still evil. We don't need to make amends for people doing evil things or find good cause for it when they're doing evil things. What's more important than that is we're not supposed to. The fact that we think we have to find the good in something that's morally bankrupt or utterly evil says a lot about where we're at. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good look. And especially when we're Christians, I mean, damn. There's a way laid out for you by God. What's it look like? It looks like you being this kind of person. Okay. But what if? Or what about now? Or what about when we lose hope or feel abandoned? It's different now, right? We can default, right? No. Who you are and who you choose to be in the face of that stuff is the truest expression of where you're really at. And if where you're really at is that you're willing to commit to things that will, while you can justify it, that it's going to help you survive, or that it's going to help you get where you need to be, or to look like the person that you need to look like. If you can justify all that, if you need to justify it, you're probably in the wrong place. Because at the end of the day, when we're expressing things that come out of a place of unrepentance, what I mean by that is a lack of remorse for doing things that aren't good, or if we have to sit up and say, you know, I understand that that probably wasn't the Christian way, but this is where I'm at. Yeah, that's probably not okay. Like, if you call yourself a Christian and you're willing to stand by a decision that you recognize was fundamentally against God, you're wrong. That's all. That's it. That's the end of it. There's no justification. There's no point where you can stand up and say, okay, but. There's no okay, but. You fucked up. That's it. Enjoy that.
Just for you two. You missed the last one.
I know.
Who timestamped?
And the thing of it is that at that point in time, that's where you need to check your heart and see where you're really at. Because the thing of it is that none of us really want to be that ferocious wolf inwardly. I know there are people that justify certain perspectives I remember one guy going off about lone wolves and so on. And he was a vegan bodybuilder, and we're not friends anymore. It's a long story.
That also narrows it down.
I mean, when you become a living meme, that's not good. It's not good. But it's something that we need to look at, we need to be aware of, is where our hearts are really at. And even to be willing to have that adjusted. We don't talk about transformation in the church for funsies. It's not some middling theme that we peddle for reasons unknown other than encouraging people or some other crap. It's because it's a real thing that happens. See, when you start recognizing who you really are and start offering that up as something to be changed, it starts to change. You don't need to take control of it. You don't need to make it happen. You don't need to do anything with it really other than lay it down. I used to get in trouble a lot because I used to say the words, give it to God, all the time. I had some people get really mad at me for preaching that over and over and over again, and I get it. Because it doesn't actually clarify, it's very Christianese. But what it does mean is that you take what's here, in here, and you lay it before God in a very literal sense. You stand before him and say, this is who I am and where I'm at. We both know this needs to change. So I'm giving it to you to change it. Otherwise, you just keep living and seeing yourself become the villain more and more and more. And sometimes all that happens is you become a different villain from the one you were before, or you become a worse person than you were before. Especially when pride gets involved. And the frustrating thing about the whole story is that there's one example that I was given to talk about, because it's probably one of the most pervasive things, and what happens all the time. Talking about the pattern of people falling into Pharisaic actions and activity. Whether we're talking about the Jews or Catholics or modern day Christians, it doesn't matter. Everybody does this. When you start focusing on the letter of the law over the intent, when that's all that your relationship with God becomes, is trying to do your best based off of what you can do to control yourself, when the fruit of the Spirit become a checklist of things that you need to do every day, as opposed to being a description of what you become when you're actively walking with and being a part of God's life. There's a story. It was out of a show called Firefly. Yeah. There was one particular episode where they had this group of guys. There were these crazed humans that acted kind of like pirates and monsters called the Reavers. So the Reavers they were people who had gone, the description that was given before the movie was that they'd gone space mad. Nobody really knew what was wrong with them. They just knew that they were savage and brutal and cruel. Basically just take all of the worst traits of humanity, the most depraved, corrupt, and evil behaviors that you would hear and that you would hear stories about. And you'd have to binge solved crime mysteries and things like that in order to get just the gist of how these people were acting, between the rape and murder and mutilation. And they'd mutilate themselves and those around them and just torture people. It was horrible. And the thing is that there was one episode in particular where the crew finds a ship that was attacked by these Reavers. And in it, they find a single survivor. He had escaped everything, but he saw what those Reavers did to the people on the ship. And the captain made an interesting observation. When they brought this kid back on the ship to take care of him, the doctor couldn't just leave him, obviously. And he told the doctor that he needed to put a bullet through that kid's head, because that was going to be the best way to save him. The reason being, by his description, was that sometimes the only way that you can actually handle what you've seen is to become what you've seen. to become what you've suffered. And that's the thing, is when we talk about a lot of things that are systemic, like I said, there's no like simple thing for this. You know, talking about villains and different things like that, that's easy. Talking about the Pharisees, that's easy, but it's a system, right? We talk about things like abuse. That's a system. See, when your parents or different people abuse you in different ways. I've seen people who were bullied in school, and then when they managed to grow up to a point where they could stand up to their bullies, they themselves became bullies. Because on some subconscious level, to them, what it meant was, in order to be strong meant being this. In order to be confident, it meant looking like this. If you are put in the position of power, then the position of power looks like this. It looks like this particular example that I have seen and experienced in my personal life. There are a lot of people who function on that level. And it was an interesting illustration of a reoccurring theme in life that a lot of people do go through. But that's the thing, is in a message like this, talking about this particular subject, that doesn't mean it's justified, okay? If you come from a system of abuse and you've learned to abuse whenever you're put in the place where you can abuse, it doesn't mean that you're okay to do it. What it means is that if you're sitting there and looking at yourself as a follower of Jesus, but you're also doing these terrible behaviors or manifesting things that you've had other people do to you, and you were hurt by them, and now you've just become the same thing, it's wrong. And it's something to be laid out in front of God. It's not something to be held up and or justified. If you're justifying it, you're wrong. It's not complicated, it's a simple concept. If you have to rationalize it, if you have to make it better than it is, there's probably a reason for that, and it's probably not actually acceptable. And you probably know that already. And if you know it needs to change, then it needs to change. And when you're finally able to see it through pride or whatever else that stands in your way, then it's important to grab onto it for what it is. Because at the end of the day, when you have to look back on years of life and you've actually been a worse person than you like to believe, and all that you have is wreckage behind you, it's going to kill you to see that and know that. We already have enough issues with guilt and shame. If we can hem that little tide, it's probably best that we do that as much as possible. So here's a way to do it. That's what I got.